Hello, everyone. My name is Robin Mitchell. I work at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and I'm going to give an overview today of the Standard Energy Efficiency Data Platform, which we call SEED for short. I think we're probably not going to have time for questions, but if you do have questions at the end, you can definitely email any of us, and I can give you an email address. SEED is a building energy data management tool. It's a web-based platform. It's developed as open source code, and here's a link to the GitHub repository. So anyone that wants to explore the code or stand up an instance can do that by looking at this GitHub repository. And I will send all the people on this attendee list this slide deck. So you'll have all the links that I have in this slide deck. And it was funded, it is currently, was and is funded by the US Department of Energy. And it's supported by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL. They do all the coding, the programming in the back end and the front end. And Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, who I work for, we do support for the software. And then there have been many third-party software contributors over the years as we've been developing the program, and here are some of them. One of the software contributors was a Canadian group that added to the open source the ability to have metric units and to have a language translation because they wanted it in French. So the fact that it's open source allows that kind of contributions from third parties, which is very valuable. And in terms of getting started with SEED, there is a website, the sort of a general support website, and it has information for users and developers. And because it's a web-based platform, you do have to put it up on a web, a server of some sort. So you can stand up your own instance of SEED. You can take the code from the GitHub repository, put it up on a server. It could be an Amazon Web Services server. It could be your own internal servers. And there is developer documentation about, in general, how to do that. And also there's documentation in the GitHub repository itself. And then if you, this would, standing up your own instances if you have the sort of IT resources to do that sort of thing, which a lot of people do not. And so we're starting to get third-party web hosting services set up. So a couple of the original contributors to the code have set up the hosting services so that you can have them stand up an instance for you and then use it on their platform. And in this website, there are these technical allies. So here are the hosting providers and their contact information. And here are the software contributors that have worked on the software so far to date. And the other thing you can do is you can get a test account through an instance that we have set up here at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. And so if any of you are interested in having a test account set up, I can do that for you. And usually what I do is someone expresses interest in getting a test account, and I find out what kind of data they have and what their use case is. And then I set up a webinar so that we can go through, actually I set up their test account, and then we have a webinar where I help them get started with importing their data just to make sure that they understand how the program works and that sort of thing. So I'm happy to do that with anyone on the call. And then in terms of just as a user, if you are using it through a web hosting or you're using a test account, on the same website, there is documentation on specific parts of the program. And there's also on the getting started section, there is this overview of main features, and it's a pretty detailed list of all the features of SEED and how to use it. And so this is a good thing to review, a good document to review, either if you're just trying to figure out all the features of SEED or if you're actually trying to use it. So this website has all those links to all those the documentation on all that. And so originally SEED was developed because several cities, New York, Philadelphia, I think Washington, D.C., San Francisco, were starting to have energy benchmarking ordinances for buildings. And it was usually the case that they were mandated to annually collect the energy consumption of commercial buildings that were 50,000 square feet or greater. And so the first task in that was for them to figure out who those building owners would be, and they didn't have a very good place to start. This was several years ago. So where a lot of them, the only data that most of them had were tax assessor records. So they would have parcel data, and it would potentially, not always, but potentially tell, there's a building on it of X amount of square feet. And so the people trying to do this benchmarking would get a data dump from their tax assessor of 50,000 square feet or greater, or tax lots with buildings 50,000 square feet or greater. And then they would use that list that potentially had the owners of the parcels on it, not necessarily the building owners, but at least the tax parcel owners. They would contact them and say, we need you to make an account in Portfolio Manager, Energy Star Portfolio Manager, enter your building's energy data, and then we're going to collect it. And so the first task was to basically, once the building owners started entering data into Portfolio Manager, the cities needed to basically make the association between these tax records that they had collected and the building data that they were getting from Portfolio Manager. And they started out doing that in spreadsheets, but it became clear that that was not the way to do it. And developing your own database tool is somewhat daunting. And so the Department of Energy decided to work on this program that we're calling SEED, as a place for all this data to be stored, and also a way to make the connections between data that might not be that easy to connect under other circumstances. So that's how it started, was associating sort of the building list with the Portfolio Manager data that the cities would be getting to do their benchmarking. And recently, the cities have been interested in adding audit data to that information that they are collecting about buildings. And so we're starting to add audit data from various audit tools into that same database. And the way that SEED works, so it's a web-based platform, and it uses application programming interfaces, APIs, to do the transactions in its own user interface, but also those APIs can be used by third-party applications, or plugins can be made to SEED to add on features, all working with these API calls. And so then the city interacts with the program, figuring out what their data looks like and trying to clean it and organize it. And then they can potentially make the data public through API calls. And I believe that the District of Columbia is one of the cities that is doing that. They have a programmer, and he makes API calls to the database directly, not through the interface on the web, and can get information about all the buildings that have submitted their data, and then can put that into a map that they put on their public website, showing the what the energy consumption is of all the buildings. So there's a lot of possibilities of getting the data, just the back-end data, through these API calls and then doing something with it. So that's the basic structure of how the program is put together. And in terms of sort of the data management side of things, the power of SEED is that you can collect data from lots of different sources and merge them together and pair them together, which we'll talk about as I go forward. And so originally, the database was sort of based on what's called a flat file, sort of one record per building in either a CSV or an Excel format. And it still has that basic structure for a lot of what the data is that's imported. For example, Portfolio Manager data is basically one record per building, and that can be imported into SEED. And the same is true of the tax lot data. It's just one record per tax lot. But now, because we're trying to add more functionality to the software, we've added the option to import XML data, which does have a data structure. It's not really flat, that can be attached to these buildings. And examples are green button data, which is interval data for energy consumption, building sync, which is an XML file that some audit tools can generate with all the characteristics of the building, and HPXML, and this is building sync is for commercial buildings. HPXML is a similar file for auditing residential buildings. And so the program is now starting to have the capability of importing these XML files and attaching them to the building records. And the thing that's nice about SEED is there's really no restriction on the number of fields or the field types in the data that you're importing. But the one thing that you do have to do if you're going to hook these files together is that at least one field needs to be common between the files that you're trying to match the records on. And traditionally, people would try to match on address, which generally is not a great data point to match on, just because different people might have different ideas about what an address is for a specific building. The tax parcel ID was one way that initially, when cities only had their parcel data, that they were, and still do, track the data. And sometimes the ordinance actually says that it has to be tracked by the tax lot ID, the parcel ID. So that's a potential matching field. And then recently, as things have progressed, some of the cities that are starting their benchmarking now have developed their own building IDs. So the issue is that you just need to make sure that whatever field you want to match on somehow gets into the data files that you need to match between. And if you do that, then you can import data files with lots of different data and connect them together. And in SEED, the data is imported and matched based on a user-defined time period, which we call a cycle, which I'll show you in a second, because originally the benchmarking was based on a yearly reporting. And so it's you don't have to do it on an annual basis. This cycle can be used, any time period that you want, but generally people are doing it on an annual basis. And then once the files have been matched together, you can query the results to see, what the state of your data is, and then use the results of those queries for specific uses that you might have. So when you, after you've imported the data and the program has matched the data together, there's a couple of things that the program does. There's a data quality checking feature of the program that you can define what kind of checks for different ranges of values that are acceptable or not acceptable. You can define those checks, and then the program does those checks when you import the file during the mapping phase, which I'll talk about. And later you can, when you've actually imported your data, you can do the data checks over and over again, because you may get, if you had error, like if a building owner had an error in their portfolio manager data and someone at the city informed them that they had an error, they might fix it and resubmit. And so then after it's been resubmitted, you may want to run the data quality again just on the building inventory that you've built up. And then you can add labels to problem data if you define it that way in the data quality checking, and I'll show you that in the program. And then once the data is in the program and you're looking at the inventory of your properties, you can filter on the data, which is basically the same as querying the data, but it's a user-friendly way to do it, sort of like Excel does it and other databases do it. And you can filter on just the data by entering data into a little filter box, but you can also then assign labels to records, and then you can filter on the labels, which I will also show you in a second. And then labels can be added in order to categorize a set of records. And there's a couple different ways you can add labels. You can kind of do it one at a time, or you can query on some data and then add labels to that data so that then you'll know what kind of state the data is in based on those labels. And then, as we talked about, there's the API connections for other applications to get the data and do something else with it. So the current use case is primarily energy benchmarking, although it can be expanded to do other things. And mostly it's commercial buildings, although there are a few cities that are using it for residential buildings. In particular, one city is using home energy score records because they can be exported sort of as a flat file, and they're storing their data in SEED. from the home energy score. And then once they have the data in seed, there's a lot of different things that the cities need to do with their data. Most of them have some kind of disclosure report based on their ordinance that they have to report all the buildings that submitted data. And then they might use seed to figure out which buildings did not submit their data properly or didn't submit data at all. And that's sort of, they could generate a list of violations, so buildings that didn't comply with the requirements. And then if they have to do a report of building stock performance, they could use seed to get the data to make those, to make that analysis. And in general, seed is not doing analysis. It's basically data management, although that is potentially starting to change a little bit. There may be some large sort of high level analysis that the program might do in the future, but basically it's a way to manage your data, and then you export the data and do the analysis somewhere else in some other way. And so the workflow is that, for benchmarking anyway, is that you're importing your data from these potentially two different sources. So the first source is your building list or your property list, and it could come from tax assessor data. It could come from real estate data, such as CoStar. It could come from some internal list that somehow a city or a county or whatever jurisdiction has generated. So that's kind of your building or property list. And then there's the benchmarking data from Portfolio Manager. And so far, all the cities that are doing benchmarking are using the EPA Portfolio Manager platform. And it's a web-based platform also, where a building owner sets up an account, enters the data about their building, including all the utility information. So you can enter monthly utility bills, and it'll add up to an annual total. And then that data is shared back with whatever city has the requirement, and then the city can collect all that data from the different building owners through their Portfolio Manager account. And so the program will match the data from these different sources, as long as they have that common field, at least one common field to match on. And the way it works in general with most of the cities that are using seed right now is that in Portfolio Manager, so they might have a parcel ID, this tax lot ID. That's what they started with, and that's how they're identifying their properties. And so in Portfolio Manager, they've asked the administrators of Portfolio Manager to add a special field. So there's a field for all these different cities in Portfolio Manager where the building owner can input their parcel ID or their building ID, whatever it is that the city wants to have in there, so that then they can match it back when they import it into seed with their building data. And so Portfolio Manager allows the user, the building owner, to put the matching field into Portfolio Manager into their account, and then that's how it's already there when they try to merge these two pieces together in seed. So, and the one thing that is potentially, the reason we set up the program initially so that we could have a relationship between two different types of data, one being this tax parcel data, and then the actual building data from Portfolio Manager or wherever. And so not all cities or jurisdictions or people using seed will need to take advantage of that relationship, but if you do need to, it's there, and I'll explain it in a second. And then the data is maintained based on a compliance year. So the workflow is that you import your data by cycle, so by compliance year, then you map the fields, and this is where you define which fields are going to be the matching fields between the different data sets. So this is where you would say this, whatever field represents the tax lot ID or the building ID or whatever. Then the program merges and pairs the data from the different data sets. And then you, as the user, can view the inventory either by parcel, tax parcel, or by building, property, which we call property, but it's really building. Then you can filter and label the inventory, and you can export your data if you're so inclined. And so this relationship between buildings and parcels, tax parcels, is what we built into the data structure. And so because of what the cities were encountering when they were trying to use their tax lots as building identifiers, which because there's this complicated relationship a lot of times between buildings and the parcel, the land parcel that they sit on. So the simple case is that you just have a building, one building on one parcel, no problem. The second case that you might have multiple buildings on one parcel. So you have a record from the tax assessor that's just one tax parcel, represents one tax parcel, but you get two different records from portfolio manager for each of these two different buildings. Maybe they have two different building owners and each one submitted separately. The third case is that you have one building, but it sits on multiple parcels. So you got all this data from your tax assessor that had all these different parcels, but really there's only one building on it, and that you only get one record when you get the data back from portfolio manager. So how do you represent that in your data model? And then there's this campus situation where you have sort of the combination of both. You have multiple buildings and they can span tax lots, or they can, be multiple buildings on the same tax lot. So in SEED, we set the program up so that it could handle that relationship. And again, you don't necessarily have to use this relationship in the program if you don't have this situation. But if you do have tax lot data, there's sort of tables in the program that handle the tax parcel side of the world. And then there's another set of tables that handle the building or property side of things. And then if there's a field that matches these two things together and you want to keep track of these two things, then the program will set up this many-to-many relationship between properties and tax lots. And I can show you real-world examples of that when we look at the program itself. And this is all done under the umbrella of the reporting cycle. So the program keeps track by reporting cycle, so potentially by year, compliance year, what tax lots and what properties were input, and then their relationship between each other. And some cities these days, they don't really care about the tax lot side of things because they've managed to somehow get just a building list. And so you can operate inside the program or in the program with just property data if you don't need to keep track of the tax lot relationship, but it's there if you need to use it for whatever reason. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the program itself. So I've imported some sample data. So this is the inventory view. This is a list of all the buildings that have been imported. And I'll come back to this. We'll sort of concentrate on this part of the program, but I want to show you some of the other aspects of the program before we get too deep into this. But basically you can see that in the inventory, so this is the inventory list here, this is the navigation bar. And so I've clicked on the inventory navigation button. And so this is where I see my list of buildings that I've imported. So there's two tabs, the view by property. So these are all the records that came in from Portfolio Manager. There's also a view by tax lot tab, which would show your tax lot records that you imported. And then here's the cycle that this belongs to, and you can have many cycles for different years or whatever. And so that's sort of the inventory view, and we'll definitely come back and go into this in more depth. But there's also a data navigation tab and an organizations tab. These are the three tabs that you will work in primarily. And let's go to the organizations tab first, because this is where you can set, and you could have multiple organizations that you belong to. I don't think any of the cities using SEED have set it up that they have more than one organization, but you could have a parent organization and sub-organizations, such as a state that had, a sub-organization by county, or a county that might have by cities or whatever. But in general, people keep it simple, and it's just one organization per account. So if I look at the organization settings, these are the members of this organization. You can always add new members if you have more staff people. You can set different permissions. Like a viewer can only view the data, can't change it. Members can add data. Owners have more power even than members. And so if you invite other staff or other reviewers into your instance, you can set up their permissions. And then the interesting things, this is where you can set up your data quality rules, set up your cycles, set up the labels that you might assign to records. So let's look first at labels, because it's nice and simple. So there are a bunch of labels that are predefined that come with the program, but you can always add new ones. You just type in a name, you give it a color, and you create the label. And so there it is somewhere, new label. And then because it's in this label list, you can use it if you want to, in the inventory, if you want to label a record, you can use a label from here. You can also create labels kind of on the fly as you need them in the inventory list, and I'll show that to you. But you can also start out with a set of predefined labels. And here are some data quality labels that I've made, and I mean, you can do it however you want. I always label the data quality ones with a DQ in front, just so that they are kind of grouped together and you can see which ones they are. And you can always edit the labels. You can change the text, you can change the color, and you can get rid of labels. So if I want to get rid of my new label, I could just get rid of it. So that's labels. So you can create them ahead of time in this list, but you can also make them on the fly as you need them in the inventory view. Then cycles, same, it's the same kind of thing. You can make new cycles, so you can set up different cycles that you can use for your compliance years if you're doing some sort of compliance cycle on an annual basis. But really the cycles are just a way to group records so that they don't interfere with each other. They're very independent of each other. And so when I'm testing the software, I make cycles where I'm using some subset of files that I want to test a certain feature on. So the cycle capability is quite powerful. I think in general, people just use, the standard compliance cycle, but you could actually make a test cycle and test a bunch of files before you actually set up your real compliance cycle, just to make sure that you were doing things correctly and that sort of thing. So it's very flexible in terms of how you can use cycles. And then the data quality rules, this is where you can set up these checks that the program will make as you import your data. It will check certain fields that you've defined here. And if it finds that the data doesn't comply with these checks, it will add a label, whatever label you've told it to do. So for example, here's a check for gross floor area, and you've said, or I've said, the user has said it should be required, like the field needs to be there, and if it's not, put this label on the record. It should not be empty. There should be a value in it, and if it's empty, put this label on the record. And it should be a minimum of 50,000 square feet. So if any record that's less than 50,000 square feet doesn't comply with this check, put this label on the record. And then there's no maximum. So this is a check to make sure that all the records coming in are greater than 50,000 square feet. And if they're less than 50,000 square feet, the program still imports them. It's going to put this label on them. And so then you can go back and look for any records that have that label associated with it, and then get in touch with the owners and find out, is it really less than 50,000 square feet, in which case it doesn't have to comply with the standard, or is it that they made a mistake and it really is, greater than 50,000 square feet. So that's how the data checking works, the data quality checking works. And you can create a new rule. And so here's a list of all the possible fields. And if I type in, I want to check for site EUI. So I just, let's see, I was going to just type site, but I'll just do it this way. So site EUI, and we can say that it's a number. We want it to be required. We want it to not be null. We'll say a minimum of 10 and a maximum of 100. So any records that are less than 10 or greater than 100, I want to add a label to. And there is a site EUI, but it's not quite what I want. So I'm going to make a new one. I'm going to say DQ site EUI suspect or something like that, high or low. And I'm going to make it orange, create the label, and then add it. So now I've added that label. So there I was making a label on the fly. That label didn't exist in this labels list, but I added it when I needed it in the data quality checking, and it will now be in that label list if I went back there. Now I save the change, and I refresh because there's a little bug there, and it's actually there, right? Okay, so I've set up my data quality rules. I've looked at the cycles, I've looked at the labels. The other thing to look at here, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in here, but I just want to talk about the highlights. So this column settings is where you can specify which fields you want the program to match on. So if you sort, I clicked a couple times on this match criteria column, and that sorts it eventually by this checkbox that's active or whatever. So in this case, I've looked at this is the property tab. So if records are coming in and I map them to the property table, then I've said I want the program to match on the portfolio manager property ID, the custom ID, and the address from portfolio manager. And I'm thinking, address, that's a bad thing to be matching on. So I'm going to uncheck that. So now it's only going to match on the portfolio manager property ID that portfolio manager assigns to the record and a custom ID that I've added to the data. And so I can save the changes. And then if I look at the tax lot tab, and again, I'll sort by this matching criteria. So again, I want the program to match on this jurisdiction tax lot ID field, but I don't want it to match on address. I'm going to take that one away too. So now it's going to match the property data by the portfolio manager ID and the custom ID and the tax data by the tax lot ID. Okay, so now we've kind of gone over the things that are important for that we need to set up ahead of time. Now, if I go to the data tab or the data navigation button, let's look at so these are data sets. So when you're importing new data, you make a data set that represents some grouping that's meaningful to you. It doesn't really matter what it is, but generally users, if they're doing the annual compliance, they'll have a data set that represents the different years. I do a bunch of testing, so I also have data sets that represent testing. But so let's look at the 2018 compliance data set. And so there have been a bunch of different files that have been imported, and they've already been imported and they've been mapped and they've been matched and all that. But I just wanted to show you, without actually taking the time to import the data, sort of how the mapping works. So this was the tax lot data that I imported. And if we look at the mapping that I set up for the program, when I imported that file, you can see, so they were all assigned to tax lot. This is just representing this is a bit of a bug in the program. It's representing the last thing that was imported, and that's been fixed in a later version that we haven't put up on our production server yet. But so anyway, originally all these records were assigned to the tax lot table, and you also have the option of the property table. So you're basically saying when you import the file, here are the original fields in the file that you're importing. Here's some sample data for 5 rows of that file. And this file that was called parcel number in the original file, because it came from the tax assessor, I'm going to change to jurisdiction tax lot ID because that was the name of my field that I want to match on, and I'm assigning it to the tax lot table. And you can actually look at the data once you've set the mapping up and make sure that it all seems to make sense. That the data is there, and you can sort by the different fields if that's interesting to you to make sure that the data is correct. So that was how the tax lot was mapped. Basically, the only matching field was jurisdiction tax lot ID, and then all the rest of the fields were basically, the names were kept the same. You could always change the names if you wanted to change the field names. And then if we look at this is the portfolio manager data, and we look at the mapping for that, you can see that, and the portfolio manager files, this is just a tiny little sample of the files. They can be huge in terms of number of fields, like basically 250 fields. So there's a lot of data in those portfolio manager files. So in this case, this represents from portfolio manager the buildings, or what we're calling properties. And so all the records in here are assigned to the property table except for the one field that we want to match to the tax lots. So in this case, in Portfolio Manager, this is just dummy data, but say the EPA for the city called Rust added a field where they could enter their tax lot ID. And so then when you get that data into seed, you say, okay, I know that parcel ID is the one I want to match to the tax lot table on the jurisdiction tax lot ID. So this is the way that the program will now associate this record from Portfolio Manager with this Portfolio Manager ID with the tax lot record with this tax parcel ID. And we'll see that when we look at the data. So that's the sort of the basics behind importing and mapping. And then if we look at the inventory, so we've imported the data, the program has paired the data. So we have two different terms. One is that the data merges records together. So for example, here's the Portfolio Manager ID. And if, well, actually, yeah, so if somebody imported their Portfolio Manager ID first time and the Portfolio Manager data and it gets this ID, then they import it again because it got fixed somehow. You want the program to merge those records together because it's an update to that Portfolio Manager ID. So that's merging the data. But then across the tax lot and property world, you actually want the records to be paired. And so in this list view, so I'm looking at the property tab, but I'm kind of in the list view. I'm just seeing the high level list of every single building, every single property that the program knows about that's been imported. But I can also, so this is a field that came from the property table. This is from the property table, but I can also add in fields from the tax lot table in list settings, which we'll look at if we have time. And so here's a case, for example, because of how the data was entered into the Portfolio Manager data, the building owner is told when entering their Portfolio Manager data, if you have a building that spans multiple tax lots, enter all the tax lot IDs separated by either a comma or a semicolon, and then seed will interpret those as separate tax lots and will make a separate record in the tax lot table for them and then pair those records with this Portfolio Manager record. So that's the case here. There's one building, we can move the Portfolio Manager. Oh, these are pinned. Let me unpin it. Yeah, so we have Portfolio Manager ID and tax lot ID. So here's a case. This is the Portfolio Manager file that represents a building, but it looks like the building owner imported it such that it sits on 3 different tax lots. And so if we click this little plus sign, we're looking kind of at the aggregated sum of the aggregation of the data for each record when it's just the list view, but if you do the little plus sign, you can see the details. So if we pin, that's why I had this pinned, if we pin it to the left, and there it is. So then we scroll over here. So here's the address that came from Portfolio Manager. So the owner considers this to be the address for the building. But in the tax lot data that we imported from the tax assessor, they actually have 3 different addresses associated with this property. This building, it sits on 3 lots and each lot has a different address. So that's the kind of information that you can see depending on how if you did import the data from the tax assessor and then it gets matched to the Portfolio Manager ID. And the same, sort of the reverse of that is if we sort by jurisdiction tax lot ID. So here's a case. So this tax lot and these 2 buildings have the same tax lot ID. So this is a case of multiple buildings on the same tax lot. And if we copy and so here's an example of filtering. You can filter, by numbers or whatever. So there's actually 3 buildings that sit on that parcel. And so in the view by tax lot, you would see, so if you can have separate, you can click on the tabs here, but it takes a while to do the view. You can also just open, see this is the tab for properties. If you just open another tab in your browser, so now I have it for tax lots. So it's just an easy way to flip back and forth between the 2 tabs without waiting for the program to refresh. So now I'm in the tax lot tab and I filter by that tax lot and we can see that it's actually these 3 properties from the property table are the ones that are in the tax lot. So then, oh, I didn't do what I said I was going to do. You can see that you have a little bit of a wait when you actually flip back and forth inside the program, inside one browser tab. So there's lots of different ways to filter data. So for example, if I'm looking at Energy Star score, so that's one of the criteria for whether something complies or not. And if I just type in double quote, it shows me all the records that came in blank. So those are problems. You need to get back with the owner and tell them they didn't, actually calculate an Energy Star score. You can see ones that are less than 10, which is probably also a bad Energy Star score. And you could, label them. So if there's this one here, and I check it, and under actions, I can say add remove label. So I could say Energy Star score here, low or no Energy Star score. And so I could add a label. And then if I go into the detail view, which is this little I button of that particular record, you will see that it got that label assigned to it. So now if I take off that, clear my filter, and then I have this label called low or no Energy Star score. If I say, show me that record, there it is. So that's sort of so these labels are kind of the equivalent of storing a query that you, made by filtering or whatever. So the one thing we can do is we could, let's just select all these records and just remove that label. So you can always add and remove labels. So instead of doing the labeling by hand based on filtering, let's run the data quality checks that we had set up. So I checked all the records here by just clicking here. This check mark at the top selects all the records, even if they go off the screen. And then I say, let's run the data quality check. And so now it's running those checks that we specified. And so here, you can you see the portfolio manager ID, the custom ID, and actually the tax lot ID. If you, oh, maybe it's not showing the tax lot ID. Okay, and then, but it shows you what the different problems. So here's a record. So custom ID 101. There's no Energy Star score. This is probably one of the blank ones. Here, the gross floor area, and that same record, the gross floor area is less than 50,000 square feet. And same thing, same record, the site UI is required, but it's blank. So you could export this to a CSV file if you wanted to. There it is. And it lists all the problems with their errors. So you could use this to generate a list that you could email your owners from if you wanted to. Let me go back to my, here it is. So there's a lot of different things you could do with the error list, but now you've those labels have been added to all these that were specified in the checker in the data quality check. So now they're labeled. So if you you say, okay, I want to see all the records where the square foot is less than 50,000 square feet, and so it looks like that's true, right? These are all records that have less than 50,000 square feet. And then we want to see which ones had the low or no Energy Star score. So that's these two. And if we, this is doing an and across the two. So these are the records that have both, a problem Energy Star score and are less than 20,000 or 50,000 square feet. But if you do or, it will show all of the problem records. In this case, the Energy Star score is fine, but the floor area is low. In this case, the floor area is fine, but the Energy Star score is low. So you could then add a label to this one saying, you could on the fly add a label and just say problem data or something like that, and then export it. The other thing you could do is you could say exclude all the records that have these labels, and then you can see 3 records actually are fine. They complied properly. Although this one, if you cared about the site UI, which I'm asserting I don't in this particular case, this one is maybe kind of a high site UI. But anyway, so you could you could check all these 3 records and you could say, okay, these are compliant, and add a label for compliant. And then if we clear the filters, now we have the compliant label added. And if we do and, not exclude, it'll show us the 3 records that we've labeled as compliant. So a couple other things. So I've kind of showed you that how you can use labeling, how you can do filters, and you can always just sort. Go away. Let me just refresh here. You can always sort the columns if you want to. And you can pin the columns, as I was showing. There's this option of pinning the columns right and unpinning them. Then there's a list settings option here, where this is where you specify which fields you want to actually display in the list view. And so, and here I've pinned those two. If I can unpin the jurisdiction tax lot ID. And there's lots of other fields that have been imported, but I've decided that these are the fields that I want for this particular list setting, and you can give it a name. And so you could have 2 different list settings for 2018 compliance. One could be like all the 250 fields that you got from Portfolio Manager, and the other might be, you know, the 10 most important ones, and they could have different names, and you can make different lists. And so that's a way that you can quickly control which fields that you're choosing. Oh, I didn't save it, so it's still going to have the pinned jurisdiction tax lot ID. And so any change that you make here, so you can move these around, right? And you could pin them or unpin them, and those all get saved to list settings if you do it sort of manually at this level. Then let's look quickly at the list view. We're sort of running out of time, but we were looking at the list view. Let's look at the detailed view. So this is where you can sort of see a history. So this is this one property. Here's the custom ID of 100, the portfolio manager ID of 2264. And this is the history of the imports for this particular record. So I imported the data from Portfolio Manager, and it had a really low site EUI, and it didn't have an Energy Star score. So presumably I talked to the building owner and told them to fix that and resubmit. So here's another set of data that came from Portfolio Manager with the data updated, and so that was imported. And you can see that the Energy Star score was updated and the site EUI was updated. And every time you import a file, this master record, so this is sort of the history of what was imported, but then the master record, which is what you see in the list view, is what gets updated. So the master record got updated on this import for Energy Star and site EUI, but then another file was imported, and this is a case where the custom IDs were added. And so there was no custom ID in these others, but you know, the city decided they were going to add some of their own custom ID. So now that custom ID is in the master record. So the master record has gotten updated every time something is imported. And we did add the capability when you're setting up the matching criteria that if there is a field that you don't want to be overwritten with updates, you can specify which field that might be, because sometimes it's a problem that the error just keeps repeating itself over and over again, and you don't want the data to be overwritten, the good data to be overwritten by bad data when you're importing it. And the program doesn't ever overwrite, well, except if you tell it to, it doesn't overwrite a value with a blank value. So if this had been imported as 100 and then another file was imported with that blank, the program wouldn't turn this blank. It would keep the 100 from the original data unless you told it differently in a more detailed screen. And the other thing that I want to show you, and you can always add a note to a particular record. And if we go back to the property list, you can see I've added some notes to a couple of these. So let's just click on this note, and it says this has Interville electric meter data. And then this note says that it has a building sync file associated with it. So we could look at the details of those two really quickly, but well, let's not. I just want to emphasize that you can do queries and then do exports. So if we say, show me all the records that are less than 50,000, or actually let's look at the compliant and then say exclude. So these are all the problem records. So you could export those. So I've checked all the records that are filtered in this case. So these are all the records that are not compliant that I've said don't have this compliant label on them because I did the exclude. And then I can just export, select it, and I could give it a file name, problem buildings, and then export it as a CSV. And then if I open up that file, so here's all the data. All the fields that were shown in the list view are the fields that are going to be in this export. So you want to make sure if there's data that you need in this export that it's actually a field that you have displaying. And the thing that the program does is it also has one field with all the labels that, so you in Excel or in another database or whatever, you could filter these labels and figure out what the problem is, or you could have exported them separately if that was important to you. And the one thing that is nice, one of the features that we've implemented in Seed, and that a couple of cities are using to great effect. So San Francisco, I believe, and maybe San Diego in California, they actually have Salesforce as a content management or customer record management system. And so that's where they keep the detailed information about who they're in touch with for the different buildings. And so they've set Salesforce up with a special module that you can install in the web when you put up your instance of Seed, that Salesforce and Seed talk to each other basically. So when you do a data quality run and it puts certain labels up, that it sends that data to Salesforce, and then Salesforce says, okay, here are the labels that, it says what the problem is, that it's the wrong square footage or it doesn't have an Energy Star score. And then Salesforce is set up to automatically send an email with the problems listed based on the labels that were added in Seed, automatically send a label to the building owner saying, you need to fix your portfolio manager data and resubmit it. So that's actually a very powerful way to get in touch with, so you're not doing so much hand, exporting from Seed and then putting together a special email or whatever, telling owners that they have this problem. The Salesforce connection to Seed allows you to really automate that. And San Francisco and San Diego and possibly others are using that to great effect. I think I've covered most of the information. So I just wanted to show a couple of things that are going to be, so let's clear our label. So we're seeing all our records. And here it says, 13 properties. So we're going to have this advanced class that Alex Swindler from NREL is going to teach. He's one of the programmers. And he's going to go into more depth with this, but I just want to give you a little preview that, so property detail. I guess I didn't really have to go to the property detail screen, but when you're in this detail view, again, there's a settings here, so you can figure out which fields you want to be displayed. But if you go to property detail, again, now I can't remember which one this is. Okay, so this is the one with the interval data for the meters. So if we go to the meters link, this is where I imported green button data. So this is electric green button data, and it's actually just from my house, from the Pacific Gas and Electric, because that was the best data I could get for a green button sample, but so it's residential. But anyway, so if you had a bunch of different meters, they would show up here if you had imported several different kinds of data. And so this is 15-minute interval data, but you can group it up to the month. So now it's aggregated by month, or you can aggregate it by year. And so if you do have electricity data actually from the utility, this is a really powerful way to keep track of the data. And I'm sure Alex will go into more detail about that. And then the other thing I wanted to show you briefly, and I think Alex will also go into more detail with this is a record where we actually I imported a sample building sync XML file. So this potentially would be from an audit that might have been done with the asset score audit template that generated a building sync file. So the program, so SEED, imports that data, and it displays some of the data that was in that XML file. So in this case, there's this measures section in the detail view. We're still in the detail view. And so in this building sync file were measures that were recommended based on the inventory that was taken. And so here's one of the measures, install low flow faucets and shower heads, and potential cost, anything that was in the XML file in terms of measures to from the inventory can be imported into SEED and basically associated with the building. So this is the way that you can associate different types of data. So we have the tax lot data associated with the property building data from Portfolio Manager, associated with meter data that we imported from Green Button, associated with building audit information that we got from Building Sync or Asset Score audit template. So that you can start to see the power of SEED, that the fact that it can connect all this data together into one place. And then potentially you can either export it or in the future, I think we'll probably add some sort of high-level dashboard to the software so that you can get with a quick glance, you can see where your building stock stands. So I think that's it in terms of what I wanted to show. I guess I have 2 minutes left. One little thing I could show, there's this reports feature at the list view, and it's a little bit limited, but it could potentially be useful. So you say, between two dates, and you have to have mapped your fields properly so that it knows what to find, but I want to look at Energy Star score against floor area. And so here's a little chart that, so it has a scatter plot and a bar chart. And this is for one particular year. If I said, show me through 2019 and update the charts, then unfortunately, my test data is just exactly the same data imported under 2 different cycles. But this is starting to do the comparison of cycles over cycles, which we in a newer version that we haven't put up on production yet, we starting to do that in a much more sophisticated way. But so this just gives you a general idea of what you could do in the report section. And I'm sure that we'll be expanding the report section over time, or we'll get a third party to do it and contribute it back. So I think that's it in terms of an overview of SEED. I'll send you, everyone that was on this call, I will send you the PowerPoint presentation, or I'll send you a PDF of that presentation. It has all the links in it to get to the various websites and the GitHub repository and such. And it'll have my email in it, and Tyler also, who's helping us organize things. It'll probably have his email, so you can get in touch with either one. If you want a test account, I can set one up and I can have a one-on-one webinar with you to see if your data can be imported, see if the program is useful to you, etc. So thanks everybody for participating, and I'll send out the email and I'll look forward to hearing from you. Thanks very much.